Good morning, everyone. I was told that we need to go ahead and get started, that the class is being streamed live, and so they wanted us to start at 10 after. Don't know how long I'll go, but it won't be any longer than 35 minutes, which is the scheduled time for us to end. This week's lesson is the book of Esther. And I want to begin in the material that we've been given for this class that Daniel has given us and talk a little bit about that. And then I want to talk with you a little bit about Purim, which is the Jewish festival that has come out of this. And it's a pretty interesting study because I doubt if too many of us have understood much about that. And I think you'll find it interesting, maybe even a little bit humorous. We all, I think, know the story of Esther. I reread the book, obviously, for today, and the NIV that I read talked about how Haman, which I've always, heard and read that he was hanged, was impaled. Now, I don't know. That's the one thing that was new to me to read out of the book. I'm not necessarily a fan of either one, but as far as Haman goes, impaling would be fine. I think they killed them first and then impaled them. I don't know how you get somebody on a 75-foot tall tree to impale them, but that's what it would have to be. But we know the story. I think if you don't know every detail of the story, you at least know about Mordecai and Esther and Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, as he was called, I think, in Persian, and Haman. Mordecai, Esther, Haman, and the king are the four principals. As you read the book, you read about a lot of eunuchs who were working in the court in various ways. You read about intrigue in the court and how there were those who were plotting the assassination of the king. This is something that, has gone on down through time and history and whatever. And of course, if you spare the king or work to see that this plot is disrupted as Mordecai did, then you're become a favored person. In Mordecai's case, that was somewhat delayed, but you become a favored person. And let me just mention the points in this material that we've been given here. And the author likes to point out that this is a journey, that the people of God are on a journey, and certainly they are. Now, again, just like with Daniel and other books, there are those who think this is a book that is more a product of 200 years later than it historically would be set. And there's not as much in it to lean me in that direction as Daniel. I think that they're right, though, that these books were written because they promoted Hebrew or Jewish solidarity, and in a time when they were dominated by other people, and talked about how they should behave, how they should act, what would be required of them. And certainly Daniel talks about that with Daniel and his three comrades. And certainly Mordecai and Esther are kind of leading the way and how this should be done. But their points are slightly different in Esther. But these are what a lot of people refer to as nationalistic books. And for instance, the Feast of Purim, while one of the now 5 feasts, not one of the 3 original ones of Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, but was added, as was the Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah. But Hanukkah and Purim were never given the status of the first 3 that are in the law. But they were added, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Well, anyway, the first point they make in the book of Esther is that the salvation of God's people comes with great risk. Well, I don't know if that's generally a point for us or not. They're talking about, he's implying that the risk that Esther took in going before the king and Mordecai not bowing to Haman when Haman came to the city gates, that's risky behavior in that setting. But certainly in the case of Esther, in the case of Mordecai, relative to trying to influence the king to not exterminate all the Jews in the kingdom, what else were they going to do? Logically, that was the only shot they had. Esther in a position where she could at least have some influence on the king if she could get access to him. And you know, the idea of access to God in the scriptures would certainly mean a lot more to people back in that day than it does to us, because in the United States we have access, not total or complete, but just about anybody can get access fairly high up the ladder. I've been in the governor's office before, sat at the governor's desk. And, you know, I'm nobody. That didn't happen back in this day. You didn't come into the presence of the king unless you were called for. And there were certain behaviors that you avoided or engaged in if you were in the presence of the king. So this idea of access, we may not understand Esther's reluctance, but if you understand that idea that goes all the way back to Moses in the burning bush and everything in between, this whole thing of access, and then in the temple with the Shekinah glory and the most holy place, and only the high priest could go there, and in the holy place only the priest could go there, and then right outside of that is the court of men, and then the court of women, and then the court of Gentiles. The whole layout was about access. So this idea of access is very big in the story of Esther. She says, I could die if I go there. He says, you're going to die anyway. And a lot more people are going to die if you don't do something. And Esther's not really considered to be a spiritual book. It's the last canonical book in the Jewish Old Testament. It was the last one to get in. And so it's not really considered the word God does not appear in the book of Esther. There is no real religious behavior outside of the fast in the book. But that, to Esther's credit, she says, well, let's pray and fast for 3 days before I make this move, you know, and bring God into it, that type of thing. The second point, and one of the things you're going to see here is in the book of Esther how deception and some really what we would consider not so nice things kind of came into the story. For instance, Esther did not tell the king that she was a Jew. She kept that from him. There was a plot to assassinate the king. Haman was going to try to get rid of all the Jews and was keeping his intentions somewhat covered. So there's a lot of deception going on here. The second point in the text or in the book that we were given is the salvation of God's people comes at the right time. Well, you know that to be true from Galatians 4, where it says, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son. These things occur in God's time, in God's framework. And that's what's often hard for us, is because we don't understand that. God operates on a different schedule than we do. The day with the Lord is 1,000 years and 1,000 years a day. What does that mean? Nothing, except God is not a time-bound creature. You and I are. We're born on a certain day, we die on a certain day, and we do things at a certain schedule in between. We go to work at this time. We do, you know, almost everything we think is time. And so it's not unusual that we would look at God and what God does and regiment that in our thinking according to time as well. And yet we shouldn't, because God doesn't. He's on his reasoning and system for bringing about things is entirely different from ours and unknown to us for the most part. You know, Abraham, I'm going to give give you this inheritance, this land, but you just have to wait 4 centuries. You know, we think, well, why did you tell me now? Of course, he never lived to see it. His ancestors did, but he didn't. He told Adam and Eve, you know, some people believe that Genesis 3:15 about he's going to bruise your heel, you're going to, I forget what the adjective is, but you're going to do something to his head that intimates that he's going to be destroyed. Is a Christ prophecy. Well, that's 2,000 years before it happened. You know, we have to try to get in our own minds the idea of how God functions. And you know, people, when I lost my mother and I lose people, and when people lose loved ones, and I don't get as sad as I used to about those things, because I'm going to be right along. You know, and it doesn't matter how old you are, you're going to be right along. I heard once say there's no time in heaven, and so when people get there and turn around, they're their loved ones. And I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But it seems like if you could count seconds in heaven, there are no seconds. There's nothing there. It's just some existence we don't understand, but they're not going to miss us, because they're going to turn around and we're going to be there. So, but we don't arrange our thinking that way, because we are time-bound creatures. God brings about these things in his time. We need to remember that as parents. I could go on about that at some length with my own experience, but it seems like a lot of things about God's work in my children are coming about as they are nearing and going past the age of 40. So, you know, that has taught me, and things about myself and things with Jan, that has taught me that we need to be sure we're more focused and even, if as much as possible, functional on God's time frame. There was urgency in the book of Esther. Things were about to happen to the Jews that were bad. We need to be able to differentiate as Christians between urgency and panic. Panic is from the world, is from Satan. Urgency, though, a proper urgency is good. And it's not always easy to tell the difference. I'm not standing up here telling you, well, there's just no problem, you should know the difference. No, but we need to understand, we know what panic looks like, okay? But there's urgency too. It saddens me to say that through my life, I've witnessed churches closing. And at some point before they closed, they panicked. And if they had been more attuned to the urgent, they would not have closed. Or it might have evolved into something besides there being no congregation at all. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get across to you here, and what I think they're trying to get across to you as well. Then there's a third point, and then we'll be through with the book, and we'll talk a minute about Purim. The salvation of God's people comes in fullness. Well, you know, you see that a lot in the Bible, and God would have us. Fullness is such a theme in the Bible. Fullness, completeness, perfection, maturity, these are all the same concept. And so it regards the individual, it regards a body of people, it regards the corporate nation before God, the theocracy. The salvation of God's people comes in fullness. That certainly happened here. The people were saved. Not only were they saved, they were able to turn on their enemies and vanquish them to a great extent. The New Testament tells us that God brought about in the fullness of time, and that the fullness of his glory and gospel was seen in the bringing in of the Gentiles. Ephesians chapter 3 teaches that. Colossians chapter 1 teaches that in very parallel type ways. And that the whole concept, the whole reason, what God was doing was to make of two men one, thereby making peace. And it's interesting that at the end of that chapter, or that passage in Ephesians 2, he says, therefore, we have access to the Father, through Christ we have access to the Father by one Spirit. All that talk about the middle wall partition and busting everything down and all that kind of stuff, what's the end goal of that? The end game is access. It's what they were let out of the garden, shoot out of the garden. Access was cut off, at least the access they'd had. And now what is there? What's been restored? Access. That was the whole plan. As much as God can restore it to us in this life, and that's why it says one day we'll have knowledge that is face to face. In 1 Corinthians 13 it says that. We shall know him even as we are fully known. God fully knows us. We don't fully know him. We have a true knowledge of him, but not a full knowledge. And yet one day we'll have that access. And that's what God's been trying to put back together ever since it was lost with Adam and Eve. It comes in different ways, in different times to different people, but God brings it about all the time. Would someone tell me what time it is, please? I left my phone in the car and don't have a watch. 26. I need 9 minutes. Could you prompt me at 9 minutes? Because I'm going to let you out a little early. You're such a good group, I just want to give you a break or something, you know? Let me say this about the addition of Purim and Hanukkah, Festival of Lights. You grew up and I grew up being told you can't add to or take away from the Word of God. Well, the Jews didn't believe that. Here are two events in the national mindset that occurred, and they added 2 festivals to their annual chart of festivals. You had Passover in the spring. 50 days later, you had Pentecost. In the fall, you had another harvest festival that they called the Festival of the Tabernacles. And to that, they added Purim and what we call Hanukkah. I just find that really interesting. Jesus went to Jerusalem, it says in John 10, for the festival. It was one of these. It was probably Festival of Lights. He observed them. So what that does to me, it makes me back off that you can't add to or take away from. Now, here's an important thing to remember. Purim and Hanukkah never had the status of the other 3. They are seen as much more nationalistic rather than religious. But they are still observed, and they're required to be observed. So these are changes that were made. But they were changes that were recognized for what they were. They were put on a specific, certain level of importance. Now, maybe that should help us in some of our thinking as things change through time. There are things that remain from God and unalterable, and there are things that we do that may be important to us, but they're not on that level. All things we deal with are not the same, and we need to understand that. We like to think that way sometimes, and I think the reason we do that is it makes things simple. But I think it also at times makes things wrong and can be a wedge to divide people rather than recognizing it for what it is. And sometime I'll talk at length about that and really give you something to say about. I'm just kidding. In the 15th century, the Italian Jews started dressing up for Purim. And they would wear ridiculous costumes. And it's the one festival for the Jews where it's all right if a man wears a woman's clothing and women wear men's clothing. And, that was a prohibition in the law. And they do this to make a point about the idea of deception. What was going on in Esther and Mordecai's day. Except they have a big party with it. It's a festival. It's like a cross between Mardi Gras and Halloween. People are encouraged to drink. I'm just telling you. And they're encouraged to get pretty far gone. And they have phrases or ways of describing that, like you drink until you can't tell the difference in Mordecai and Haman or something like that. And I know that sounds bizarre to us, That's in the literature. That's what they did. They developed certain practices as the story of Esther was read in the synagogue. When Haman's name is said, they hissed. They would take 2 stones and write Haman's name on both of them and clack them together like this until his name was gone. In the synagogue, they would do this till it was gone. And that they were to engage in during Purim. They had to be in the synagogue and listen to the public reading of the book of Esther. And there were rabbis in subsequent days, and this is true even in the Orthodox Church, who said that the book of Esther should be read by a woman. In progressive Orthodox congregations, and then in conservative and Reform, frequently it is read by a woman. That's a big change, at least for the conservative Orthodox. You send food gifts to friends. This is frequently like candy, or you bake them something. They bake this thing called a Haman's Pocket, and it's a 3-sided pastry, and it can put sweet or savory stuff in the middle. And a lot of those are exchanged. You're supposed to give charity to the poor. One place I read, they wanted to know what the minimum you could do was, and 2 slices of bread was the minimum. And they said if you're going to give 100 coins, that it was better to give 1 coin to 100 people rather than 100 coins to 1 person, because more people were made happy that way. And the last one was eating a festive meal. I've already talked about that. It's observed in March or April, usually March. And go to Wikipedia and look it up and read about it. It is very interesting to see how they took this. But again, I tell you, it's much more of a nationalistic observance than it is a religious observance. Next week, neither Frank nor I will be here because we're going to both be in the same place somewhere where it's sandy and warm. And so Brother Hodge will be talking to you from the first 7 chapters of Nehemiah. And I know that'll be good. Thank you for your kind attention.